Okay, you're campaigning, and you just kind of alluded to it, to your record as a tough, bottom-line, former business executive, but you want to extend all the Bush tax cuts, which would add $4 trillion to the deficit. You say, balance the budget by cutting spending. Question, as a bottom-line businesswoman, where are you going to find $4 trillion to cut?
Well, let's just start with the fact that, as you pointed out in your last interview, spending has skyrocketed out of control in the last 2 years. It's true that government has grown steadily for 60 years, but the last two, it's gotten really out of control. And one of the things I know, as someone who started at the very bottom as a secretary and ultimately ran the largest technology company in the world, you show me $1 billion that no one's accountable for, that no one scrutinizes, that no one has any responsibility over making sure that it's spent wisely and well, and I'll show you hundreds of millions of dollars worth of waste. The GAO just released a report that said 22% of federal programs fail to meet their objectives. The truth is, we don't know how taxpayer money is spent in Washington, D.C., which is why I think we ought to put every agency budget up on the Internet for everyone to see. I think we ought to ban earmarks. I think we ought to give citizens the opportunity to designate up to 10% of their federal income tax toward debt reduction. If we did that, we would reduce our debt by $95 billion a year.
But Ms. Fiorina, I mean, the traditional ways that people talk about non-discretionary, discretionary non-defense spending is only 16% of the budget. You could cut all of that out, all for education and energy and for police support and government worker support around the country. It wouldn't be anywhere close to $4 trillion. Where are you going to get that kind of money if you extend all of the Bush-era tax cuts? And that doesn't even that only adds to the deficit. That doesn't even deal with the deficit we already have.
Well, of course, first, the thing that we need to do to deal with our debt and our deficit is to both cut spending and grow the economy. That's fundamentally what we have to do. Those tax cuts are central to growing the economy. Indeed, I would argue there are some additional tax cuts we need to make. When we're dealing with a 35% tax on business when the world average is 18%, we're increasingly uncompetitive. When our R&D tax credit is 17th in the world, when it should be number one, we're increasingly uncompetitive. But back to your subject on spending. Look, the truth is that politicians, career politicians like Barbara Boxer, who has been in Washington, D.C. for 28 years, somehow never get around to the business of asking the fundamental questions that voters want asked now. How are you spending our money? Why is it that every agency gets more money every year, regardless of their performance? The budget of the EPA has increased by 37% in the last year.
Ms. Fiorina,
that's crazy. We can cut spending.
Let me ask you a specific question, because I still haven't gotten many specifics from you on how you're going to cut $4 trillion and even more out of the budget. Back when there was talk about a nonpartisan or bipartisan deficit debt commission, you blasted that idea in January, said we already know all the solutions, we don't need another commission to study it. So now, as a non-career politician, as the anti-Barbara Boxer, you tell me specifically, what are you going to do to cut the billions, the trillions of dollars in entitlements?
Okay, first, I didn't blast the commission saying we already had all the solutions. I blasted the commission because I believed it was a feint for tax increases. And indeed, we are now hearing, coming out of Washington, D.C., that a value-added tax is going to be one of the recommendations of that commission. A value-added tax would be incredibly destructive to this economy at a time when we need to be growing our economy.
Where are you going to cut? Where are you going to cut? Entitlements. What benefits are you going to cut? What eligibility are you going to change?
You know, Chris, I have to say, with all due respect, you're asking a typical political question. The American people say, you know what? When we have 22% of our federal government programs that are not meeting their objectives, when we have at least 2 nonpartisan studies that suggest that there is up to $500 billion worth of waste in the federal government budget, let us please get after that first before we start talking about cutting entitlements. What politicians do, in my estimation,
it may be a typical political question, Ms. Fiorina, but that's where the money is. The money is in Medicare. The money is in Social Security. We've got the baby boomers coming. There is going to be a huge explosion of entitlement spending, and you call it a political question when I ask you to name one single entitlement expenditure you're willing to cut.
Chris, I believe that to deal with entitlement reform, which we must deal with, we ought to put every possible solution up on the table, except we should be very clear that we are not going to cut benefits to those nearing retirement or those in retirement. But having said all of that, for years and years, career politicians, frankly, of both parties, have said, oh no, the only way to cut spending is to deal with entitlements. It's the political third rail. And then they never get about the business of cutting out waste and inefficiency. They never get to the point of banning earmarks.
Waste, fraud, and inefficiency.
Exactly.
Exactly. For 30 years, I covered Ronald Reagan in 1980 when he talked about it. There isn't that kind of money in waste, fraud, and inefficiency.
But you know what, Chris? The budget just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And every year as it gets bigger, particularly in the last two, there's more waste, fraud, and inefficiency. And you're right, nobody ever gets around to it. It's why voters in California, and I believe a lot of voters all across the country, are tired of career politicians. Honestly, Chris, every business and every family in America know that at some point you have to start looking at your spending. So let's start looking at our spending, but let's not just breeze on past the fact that we have hundreds of billions of dollars worth of waste and inefficiency and fraud. We have it in the $810.
I'm going to try one last time, and if you don't want to answer it, Ms. Fiorina, you don't have to.
It's not a question. It's not a question of not wanting to answer it.
But let me ask the question, if I may, please. You're not willing to put forward a single benefit. I'm not even talking about the people that are 60, or let alone 65 or 70. I'm talking about people under 55. You're not willing to say there's a single benefit eligibility for Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security that you're willing to say, yeah, I would cut that.
What I think we need to do to engage the American people in a conversation about entitlement reform is to have a bipartisan group of people who come together and put every solution on the table, every alternative on the table, and then we ought to engage in a long conversation with the American people so they understand the choices. Instead of rushing off into a closed room and having 100 senators figure it out for themselves, we need to engage the American people in the conversation, and I'm willing to consider any alternative. But we cannot continue to just jump over the fact that our government is bloated, wasteful, inefficient, in many cases inept, and frankly in many cases as well corrupt. We have to deal with that.
Ms. Fiorina, we got less than a minute left. I want to ask you one other question. Sarah Palin has been campaigning for Republican candidates in California this weekend. She endorsed you in the Republican Senate primary. You say you had a previously scheduled event. I mean, isn't the real fact that you don't want to be seen with Sarah Palin because she's not very popular with independents and she, at this point in a general election, would hurt you, not help you?
I'm very proud of my endorsement from Sarah Palin, and I've said that over and over again, but the facts are that I had a previously scheduled commitment for months with a group of veterans and John McCain. I had a previously scheduled group of fundraisers and rallies. Campaign schedules are complex things, as you can imagine. We got word of her trip very late in the game, and so I'm delighted she came to California. I know that she helped raise a lot of money, and we had commitments to keep as well.
Ms. Fiorina, we're going to have to leave it there. We want to thank you so much for joining us today, and safe travels on the campaign trail.
Great to be with you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Up next, President Obama makes some